At 1 minute past midnight on August 19th, 2026, a 50% tariff was scheduled to hit $20 billion worth of Canadian goods crossing into the United States. Wine, hockey sticks, cement, furniture, dairy. It was set in motion by a law that had not been used once in the 96 years since it was written. And less than 2 hours before it took effect, it did not happen. Not because Canada quietly backed down, not because the United States backed down either, but because two governments that have spent months calling each other's trade practices unfair sat down at the table in Washington and, at the last possible moment, agreed to hit pause. That is the real story behind the headlines this week, and it is a more complicated one than a simple story of who blinked first, or who forced whom to the table in Washington. To understand it, you have to go back to a law from the Great Depression, a Supreme Court ruling from earlier this year, and a trade relationship between two countries that share the longest undefended border on Earth. A border that sees roughly 330,000 people and $2 billion in goods cross it every single day, according to reporting from the Associated Press. This is the story of how that relationship ended up on the edge of a cliff, and how, for now, it stepped back. Let's start with where things actually stood before this latest chapter. Canada and the United States have argued about trade for decades. Softwood lumber, dairy quotas, steel. These are old fights, recycled across multiple administrations. But the current standoff traces its roots to earlier this year, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in February 2026 that a broad set of tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, were unlawful. Those tariffs had been a central pillar of President Trump's trade strategy against dozens of countries, including Canada. When the court struck them down, the administration did not retreat from tariffs as a strategy. It went looking for other legal tools to use instead. One of those tools was Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which the administration invoked on February 24, 2026, to impose a global 10% tariff, according to Canada's own Trade Commissioner Service. That tariff, which is capped by law at a maximum of 150 days, applied broadly, though CUSMA-compliant Canadian and Mexican goods were largely exempt. Alongside that came the long-standing Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper, which by April 2026 were running as high as 50% on the full value of covered goods, not just the metal content, based on details published by Canada's federal government and confirmed by PwC Canada's tax analysis. So even before the latest escalation, Canadian exporters were already absorbing significant new costs to sell into the American market. The back and forth before July was already extensive, and it matters for understanding why both governments arrived at this point so worn down. Canada's own Department of Finance had spent much of 2025 rolling out relief measures for its own businesses squeezed by the tit-for-tat tariffs. On April 15, 2025, then Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne announced temporary 6-month tariff relief for American goods used in Canadian manufacturing, processing, and food and beverage packaging, along with exemptions for goods tied to public health, healthcare, public safety, and national security, according to a government news release reported by the CBC. That same announcement introduced a performance-based remission framework for Canadian automakers, allowing companies that kept manufacturing vehicles in Canada to import a set number of American-assembled, USMCA-compliant vehicles without paying Canada's own countermeasure tariffs, with that allowance shrinking if a company reduced its Canadian production or investment. Ottawa also stood up something called the Large Enterprise Tariff Loan Facility, giving large Canadian businesses access to financing support to help them ride out the disruption. Those temporary exemptions kept getting extended, which tells its own story about how long this dispute has actually dragged on. According to an October 17, 2025 news release from Canada's Department of Finance, Champagne extended the manufacturing and food packaging exemption by an additional 2 months and expanded it to include goods used in agricultural production, while also extending the public health and safety exemption on the same timeline. Canada additionally opened up relief for companies that could demonstrate short supply situations or existing contractual obligations tying them to American suppliers. On the American side, Canadian companies serving as the official importer of record for goods brought into the U.S. under the earlier IEEPA tariff regime became eligible as of April 20th, 2026 to apply for refunds on tariffs they'd already paid between February 2025 and February 2026, a direct byproduct of the Supreme Court ruling that knocked down that legal basis for the tariffs in the first place, according to trade tracking published by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Steel, aluminum, and copper became their own semi-permanent battleground, running in parallel to the dairy, alcohol, and auto disputes. A June 1st, 2026 presidential proclamation, detailed in tax analysis from PwC Canada, gave some relief to Canadian manufacturers of agricultural equipment, construction machinery, and certain HVAC systems, dropping tariffs on some steel and aluminum derivative products from 25% down to 15%, while simultaneously expanding coverage to include more industrial equipment like bulldozers and forklifts at that same 15% rate. That same proclamation gave U.S. Customs and Border Protection explicit new authority to penalize importers for fraud or deliberate misrepresentation of a product's American content claims, reinforcing that origin documentation had become a serious compliance risk for companies moving goods across the border in either direction. Canada, for its part, worked with its railway sector in the spring of 2026 to secure a 50% reduction in rail freight rates, specifically for Canadian steel and lumber shipments, an attempt to soften the blow for its domestic producers, according to reporting compiled by Doane Grant Thornton. It wasn't only a two-country fight either. On July 24, 2026, separate from the Section 338 proclamations, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office finalized a Section 301 investigation into 60 foreign economies, Canada included, concluding they had failed to adequately enforce prohibitions on imports made with forced labor. That action imposed its own 10% tariff on countries that had at least committed to adopting forced labor import bans, rising to 12.5% for countries that hadn't, according to the law firm Blake's detailed timeline of the dispute. Canadian goods that were fully USMCA compliant were carved out of that particular measure, but it added yet another layer to an already complicated stack of overlapping tariff regimes that importers on both sides of the border had to track simultaneously. Section 122's global 10%, Section 232's metals tariffs, Section 301's forced labor tariffs, and now Section 338 on top of all of it. Then came July the 20th, and the escalation that finally forced the issue to a head. On July 20th, 2026, President Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations, each invoking a nearly forgotten provision of law called Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. If that year sounds familiar, it should. Section 338 is a surviving piece of the original Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, the same law historians and economists widely blame for deepening the Great Depression by choking off global trade in the early 1930s. According to legal analysis published by the law firm BLG, Section 338 descends even further back, to a 1922 predecessor statute, and in the entire 96 years it has existed, no American president had ever actually used it to impose a tariff, until this July. What makes Section 338 different from the tools the administration used before is worth pausing on, because it explains why this escalation felt so abrupt to businesses on both sides of the border. Section 301 of the Trade Act, the law used for things like the tariffs on China during the first Trump term, requires a formal investigation by the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. Section 232, the law behind the steel and aluminum tariffs, requires the Commerce Department to formally find that imports threaten national security. Section 338 requires neither. As legal experts at the firm, Holland and Knight and others have noted, a president can invoke it by proclamation alone. No investigation, no public hearing, no agency review. The president simply has to find as a fact that a foreign country is discriminating against U.S. commerce, and the tariffs can follow. The White House used that authority to target 3 specific Canadian sectors. According to a fact sheet published by the White House itself, the administration pointed to a roughly 22% decline in Canadian motor vehicle exports to the United States over the year ending in March 2026, from $25.9 billion down to $20.3 billion, alongside an 81% collapse in Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages, from $718 million down to just $137 million, after most Canadian provinces pulled American liquor off their shelves in response to earlier trade disputes. The third proclamation targeted Canada's dairy tariff rate quota system, which the administration argues treats American cheese and dairy products far more restrictively than it treats dairy imports from the European Union, despite Canada having trade agreements with both. Each of those 3 proclamations came with its own list of covered products, and this is where the story gets important for the U.S. companies at the center of this whole situation. Despite the proclamations being labeled around motor vehicles, dairy, and alcohol, the actual product lists sweep in a far broader range of goods. According to analysis from Thomson Reuters and multiple international trade law firms who reviewed the official annexes, the tariffs also apply to wine, hockey sticks, cement, plywood, furniture, fishing rods, seeds, clothing, footwear, luggage, cosmetics, toys, swimming pools, and a long list of other consumer and industrial products that have little obvious connection to cars, cheese, or whiskey. In total, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office put the exposure at nearly $20 billion, or roughly 5% of everything the United States imports from Canada in a given year. And here is the detail that gets lost in a lot of the coverage But that matters most for understanding why American companies were the ones raising alarms rather than just Canadian exporters. Tariffs are not paid by the exporting country. They are paid by the importer of record, meaning the American company that brings the goods across the border. When a 50% duty gets slapped on Canadian lumber or Canadian electronics components, it is the American manufacturer, retailer, or distributor who writes the check to Customs and Border Protection, not the Canadian company that shipped the goods. That cost then either gets absorbed by the American business, passed along to American consumers, or some blend of both. That dynamic is exactly why industry groups moved quickly once the July 20th proclamations were announced. The Consumer Technology Association, one of the largest trade groups representing American electronics and tech companies, issued a statement the very next day. Its executive chair, Gary Shapiro, said plainly that the Section 338 tariff actions made, in his words, the business environment less certain for companies on both sides of the border. He specifically flagged that eliminating the usual carve-outs for goods that qualify under the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement undermined the broader effort to renew a stable trade deal that keeps American businesses competitive globally. Shapiro's statement pointed to the ongoing USMCA review process as, in his words, an off-ramp, a chance for negotiators to resolve the underlying disputes before the tariffs actually bit into supply chains. That word, uncertainty, comes up again and again in how American businesses and their lawyers describe the situation in the weeks leading up to August 19th. Multiple law firms advising importers, including Wiley, Butts Along, and Holland & Knight, published detailed alerts urging American companies bringing in Canadian origin goods to immediately review their supply chains against the official tariff annexes, because the coverage extended so far beyond the headline categories that, as one analysis from Thomson Reuters put it, a business that assumed it was safe because it doesn't import dairy, alcohol, or vehicles may well have discovered it wasn't safe at all. One particularly important detail buried in the legal filings. Unlike most previous tariff actions, these Section 338 duties apply regardless of whether a product qualifies for preferential treatment under the USMCA. A valid certificate of origin, which had shielded goods from earlier tariff rounds, provided no protection here. That is a significant departure from how trade relief has typically worked between the two countries, and it is part of why the reaction from the business community was so immediate. There was also a legal cloud hanging over the whole maneuver, because Section 338 had never actually been used before. Several trade law experts, including analysis published by the Conference Board and reporting from Holland & Knight, noted that litigation from American importers was considered likely if the tariffs actually took effect, with open legal questions about whether other, more established tariff statutes should have taken precedence and whether the president was required to conduct some kind of investigation before proceeding. None of those legal questions had been resolved in court as of this week. Meanwhile, on the Canadian side, the political response was anything but quiet, though it did not amount to Canada simply digging in and refusing to engage, which is a meaningful distinction from how this dispute is sometimes framed. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney criticized the proposed tariffs as the latest in what he described as a series of unilateral American trade actions inconsistent with the USMCA, according to reporting from Mondeck and legal analysis from Butts Along. But Carney simultaneously reaffirmed that Canada wanted to resolve the dispute through negotiation, and pointed to proposals Canada had already put forward to modernize the USMCA and address the underlying trade complaints. That is a notably different posture than simple refusal. It is closer to firm negotiation under pressure. At the provincial level, the politics ran hotter. Ontario Premier Doug Ford publicly urged a dollar-for-dollar retaliatory response, according to analysis from the law firm BLG, and Carney's own public language described the ongoing talks with Washington in blunt terms, at various points calling the negotiations nasty, delicate, and intense, according to reporting from Al Jazeera. That tension came to a head in the week leading up to August 19th. Officials on both sides scrambled to find a landing zone before the tariffs kicked in. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer met with Canadian officials at the Department of Commerce in Washington just 2 days before the deadline, an image captured by the Canadian press and distributed by the Associated Press. According to NPR's reporting, President Trump ultimately announced on his social media platform that he was delaying the 50% tariffs on the $20 billion in Canadian imports, striking the deal less than 2 hours before the sanctions were set to take effect. Al Jazeera's reporting confirmed the same sequence, noting that Carney publicly confirmed the United States had agreed to suspend the tariffs until August 22nd, buying a few additional days for negotiators to work out a longer-term arrangement. It's worth being direct about what that delay actually is, because a lot of the online commentary around this story has overstated it in both directions. It is not a permanent resolution. It is not a signed trade agreement. According to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, whose president and CEO, Candice Lying, issued a statement following the announcement, the delay offered businesses what she called some relief. but she was careful to note it fell short of the certainty that a signed interim agreement would actually provide. Her exact words, as reported, described the current situation as not anyone's preferred outcome, and she urged negotiators to move quickly toward something more permanent. That is a realistic, sober assessment, and it's a useful corrective to any narrative on either side of the border claiming total victory. There are signs of where a broader deal might be heading, though nothing is finalized. Bloomberg reported this week, citing people familiar with the discussions, that the tentative agreement under negotiation would lower tariffs on certain Canadian steel and aluminum exports from the current 50% down to 25%, though the details had not been finalized at the time of that reporting, and different rates could still apply to specific derivative products containing those metals. Separately, according to the Washington Post's reporting from earlier in the week, industry executives and trade specialists described the two countries as inching closer to an agreement that would spare products like hockey sticks, wine, and cement from the full 50% hit. Why would either side want a deal at all, given how aggressively both governments have postured throughout this dispute? The reporting offers some fairly grounded, unglamorous answers. According to the Associated Press and the Boston Globe, the Trump administration has its own domestic incentive to avoid the tariffs actually landing. American voters are already frustrated with the cost of living, and a 50% tariff paid by American importers tends to show up, eventually, in the prices American consumers pay at the store. With midterm elections coming in November, a wave of price increases tied directly to a tariff fight. With a close ally is not an outcome either. Party in Washington is eager to campaign on. Ryan Madras, a partner at the law firm King and Spalding and a former U.S. trade official, put it simply in comments to the Associated Press, neither side really wants the tariffs to actually take hold, and there is a fairly strong push on both sides to find what he called an off-ramp. Madras also pointed to what the United States actually wants out of a broader deal, beyond simply resolving the dairy, alcohol, and auto disputes. According to his comments, Washington is pushing Canada to purchase more American military equipment, including F-35 fighter jets, to participate in the administration's proposed Golden Dome missile defense system, and to grant the United States greater access to Canadian critical minerals, a move that would reduce American dependence on supply chains running through China, a geopolitical rival. On the other side of the table, Canadian negotiators are reportedly seeking relief from the layered stack of American tariffs that have accumulated over the past year and a half. The Section 232 metals tariffs, the Section 122 global tariff, and now the Section 338 duties on top of all of it. It's also worth understanding just how unusual Section 338's structure is, because it shapes what happens next, even with a delay in place. According to the legal analysis from BLG, this law contains no sunset provision, and unlike the Section 122 tariff, with its hard 150-day cap, appears to allow the tariffs to continue indefinitely unless the president chooses to reduce, modify, or terminate them. More strikingly, the statute includes an escalation mechanism found in no other modern American tariff authority. If the president later finds that a country's discrimination has been maintained or increased even after the tariffs are imposed, the law authorizes him to exclude that country's products from the U.S. market entirely. Not a higher tariff rate, but an outright embargo. That is the backdrop against which both governments were negotiating, and it explains why officials in Ottawa reportedly viewed the situation as genuinely high stakes rather than a routine trade squabble. It's worth sitting with the Smoot-Hawley connection a bit longer, because it's not just a colorful historical footnote. It's the actual statutory foundation for everything that happened this summer, when Congress passed the original Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930. The goal was to protect American farmers and manufacturers during the early years of the Depression. Instead, according to the consensus view among economists and historians cited in NPR's reporting this week, the law triggered a wave of retaliatory tariffs from America's trading partners, shrank global trade volumes, and is widely considered to have deepened and prolonged the economic collapse rather than cushioning it. Section 338 survived in the U.S. Code for nearly a century afterward as an unused, almost forgotten provision, a tool available to presidents in theory, but never actually pulled off the shelf, in part because the diplomatic and economic risks of using such a blunt, investigation-free instrument were considered too high. That changed on July the 20th, 2026, and trade lawyers reviewing the move have been explicit that the precedent set here, a president using proclamation-only authority to bypass the more deliberate processes required under Section 301 or Section 232, could become a template for how the administration handles future disputes with other trading partners, not just Canada. On the Canadian side, the government did not simply absorb the pressure quietly. Canada maintains its own relief architecture for businesses hit by the broader trade war, running through the Canada Border Services Agency. According to details published on Canada's own government website, companies can apply through either the Duties Relief Program or the Drawback Program, both of which allow qualifying businesses to import commercial goods without paying duties or to receive a refund on duties already paid, provided the goods are eventually re-exported. Remission has also been granted on a generally available basis for goods used in public health, healthcare, and public safety, along with specific categories of motor vehicles, such as motorhomes, ambulances, and prison vans, under Canada's own United States surtax remission order. Companies that don't fit neatly into those existing categories can file a direct remission request with Canada's Department of Finance, though trade advisors note that process involves an extensive submission process and case-by-case review. Individual provinces have layered on their own support as well. New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, for instance, jointly fund a tariffs and customs advisory program to help regional businesses navigate the shifting rules, while the federal government separately runs liquidity support and worker assistance programs specifically for the forest sector, which has been hit hard by lumber-related duties on top of everything else. For American businesses specifically, the practical guidance in the days before the delay was announced was strikingly uniform across law firms and trade advisors. GHY International, a customs brokerage that has been closely tracking the Section 338 rollout, noted a detail that caught several shippers off guard, unlike Canada's own approach to tariff timing, which is generally based on when goods ship U. S Customs and Border Protection calculates duty based on the date a shipment is formally entered for consumption at the American border, meaning the arrival date, not the shipping date. A shipment that left a Canadian facility well before the deadline could still have been hit with the 50% duty if it crossed into the United States after the cutoff. Freight and trade advisors, including analysis from freight figures, pointed importers toward moving covered goods into bonded foreign trade zones under what's called privileged foreign status before the deadline, a maneuver that locks in the tariff classification and rate at the moment of admission rather than the moment of eventual sale, preserving flexibility while the broader dispute continued to play out. Notably, no formal tariff exclusion process was ever announced for Section 338, which stands in contrast to Section 232 and Section 301, where American importers have historically been able to petition for individual product exclusions. Trade analysts covering the rollout advise businesses plainly not to plan around obtaining relief through a formal petition process because none existed. That absence of a safety valve is part of why the pressure on both Washington and the businesses caught in between built so quickly in the run-up to the deadline. So where does that leave things as of today? The 50% tariffs that were supposed to take effect on August 19th did not take effect, at least not yet, and not on the original terms. Negotiators bought themselves until August 22nd, with reported progress toward halving the steel and aluminum tariff rate and sparing some of the broader consumer goods categories. But nothing is signed. The underlying legal authority, a Depression-era statute with no formal limits and a built-in embargo mechanism, remains available to the administration if talks break down again. And American companies that import from Canada, from small hockey equipment distributors to major electronics and furniture retailers, are left managing supply chains under a rolling deadline that could shift again with very little notice. There's also a separate, smaller dispute running alongside the big one that shows just how granular this trade fight has gotten. Effective July 31st, 2026, Canada's federal government added its own temporary 25% surtax on imports of certain wood cabinets and vanities, while it investigates whether a surge of imports is harming Canadian manufacturers, according to tracking by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. The United States, along with Mexico, Israel, Chile, and a group of developing countries, was exempted from that particular measure, and the surtax can run for up to 200 days while the investigation plays out, after which it either gets removed or replaced with a longer-term trade measure. It's a reminder that even as the headline fight over dairy, alcohol, and motor vehicles dominates the coverage, both countries are running smaller, sector-specific trade actions in parallel, each with its own investigation, its own exemption list, and its own businesses caught in the middle trying to figure out which rules actually apply to their shipment. Before wrapping up, it's worth naming exactly where these facts came from, because a story with this many moving parts deserves that kind of transparency rather than just asking you to trust it. The core tariff actions and their legal basis are drawn from the official Federal Register filings and the White House's own published fact sheet on the Section 338 proclamations. The business and legal reaction came from trade law firms including Wiley, Butzel Long, Holland and Knight, BLG, MLT Aikens, and Blake's, along with the Consumer Technology Association's public statement from Gary Shapiro. The historical and negotiating context, including the last-minute delay reached on August 19th, came from wire and broadcast reporting by the Associated Press, NPR, Al Jazeera, Bloomberg, and the Washington Post, along with a statement from Candice Lang of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and comments from trade attorney Ryan Majoris. Details on Canada's own relief programs came directly from the Canadian government's Department of Finance and its Trade Commissioner Service, along with reporting from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, KPMG, Doane Grant Thornton, and PwC Canada. Now, before wrapping up, it's worth being clear-eyed about what's confirmed and what isn't. The tariff proclamations, their effective date, the specific percentages, and the broad product categories are all matters of public record, documented in the Federal Register and confirmed by the White House's own fact sheet. The delay reached on August 19th is confirmed by multiple independent outlets, including NPR, the Associated Press, and Al Jazeera, with Prime Minister Carney's own public confirmation cited directly. The reported details of a broader tentative deal, particularly the specific 25% figure for steel and aluminum, come from Bloomberg's sourcing to people familiar with the talks, and those details had not been officially finalized or confirmed by either government at the time of that reporting, so that peace should be treated as developing rather than settled. Similarly, the likelihood of litigation over Section 338's legal basis is analysts' informed expectation, not a filed lawsuit as of this writing. What does seem clear, cutting through the noise, is that this was never really a story about Canada simply refusing to move. The people with the least room to maneuver in all of this were the businesses in the middle, American importers, who had no say in the underlying trade dispute but were the ones legally obligated to pay the tariff bill the moment goods crossed the border. And Canadian exporters, watching a market that took in nearly 1/5 of their motor vehicle exports and huge volumes of dairy, alcohol, and consumer goods, suddenly become 20, 30, 50% more expensive to sell into overnight. That's the story as it actually stands, verified against government proclamations, court history, and reporting from outlets across the political spectrum, rather than flattened into a simple narrative of one side winning and the other losing. If you found this useful, sticking around for the next update is probably worth it, because this is very much not over. The delay runs out in just a few days, and whatever comes out of these negotiations will shape how these two countries trade with each other for years to come. If deeper breakdowns like this one are useful to you, following along means you won't miss where this goes next. So here's the honest question worth sitting with. Section 338 gives the president the power to raise tariffs indefinitely, with no formal exclusion process and an embargo hanging over the negotiation as leverage. Is that the kind of tool that should exist in trade policy between two of the closest allies on Earth? Or is it exactly the kind of leverage that gets a deal done faster than politeness ever could? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.